One of the many wonderful things about the Nobel Conference is that we have ample opportunity for the panelists to engage with each other right after their talks. And they have the opportunity to ask questions, and then we have also taken questions from the audience that we will ask. And I know that Mark Lewis has a question to kick us off. So Mark Lewis.
Okay. Well, Dr. Kandel, it was a pleasure to hear you talk in person. I don't hear anything. I liked what you said. And it reminds me a lot of the fact that when people, some of the very powerful governmental and medical research bodies here in this country, NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, which is part of the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, and all these bodies, and so forth, define addiction as a brain disease. And the primary argument for defining addiction as a brain disease is that addiction changes the brain. But what you're saying is that changing the brain is actually exactly what the brain is designed for, and that if we didn't continue to change the brain with learning experiences, we'd be in big trouble. So how would you respond to their way of defining addiction and their reason for defining addiction as a brain disease?
I didn't hear you very well, to be honest with you.
The audio is not good.
Did other people hear him clearly? There's something wrong with the audio.
Owen, did you hear it a little better?
Well,
I could try.
I think I'm projecting, it sounds like, but it doesn't sound like Mark was projecting.
No.
Very
Is
well.
that right? Oh.
Well, I think I caught your question. The question is, what are the grounds for thinking that addiction is a brain disorder? Is that your question?
Based on, I'll try to talk louder. Does that help if I speak more loudly?
Yes.
Okay. The brain disease model, the brain disease camp, draws its first argument from saying that addiction changes the brain, causes all these brain changes, and some of them are actually in the prefrontal cortex, we know. So, but you're saying that brain change is a really good thing and a very important part, well, the fundamental aspect of learning and development of memory and personality and all the rest of it. So how can anyone argue that brain change itself is a reason to define addiction as a brain disease?
That is not the reason why it's defined as a brain disease. The reason it's defined as a brain disease is that most students of the brain, with very rare exceptions, think that every aspect of your behavior, from your most erotic fantasy to your most religious experience, emanate from the brain.
Yeah.
Everything you are as a human being, in terms of, intellectual, social, emotional processes, are brain processes. So it's not any distinction being made for addiction. Addiction is like schizophrenia, is like depression, it's like every other disorder, including normal behavior, normal enjoying of a glass of wine. These are all brain processes. There is no other state. This is the current view of most brain scientists.
I agree with you. So the problem is that some other people say that, the bad guys say that.
No, it's not a question. It's not a question of good guys or bad guys. It's a question of how familiar are people with the current understanding of how the brain functions.
But we have very sophisticated neuroscientists like Nora Volkow, who's the head of NIDA, who says that addiction is a disease because it changes the brain. How does that square with what you're saying?
But she assumes that you have the same philosophical premise that she has, that everything comes from the brain.
I think I do. I think you do too.
I absolutely have that.
I'm not a neurobiologist, but I want to weigh in on this. Not all change is good. Some change can be good, some change can be bad. So I think this is what we have to keep in mind.
So the fact of brain change, the degree of brain change, is not necessarily the issue. If you're a London cab driver, that brain change is very important. So it's the type of brain change that matters.
Exactly right. Brain change is just further evidence of the fact. If you couldn't find any brain change whatsoever for a process, you got a problem.
Yeah.
And this is the problem we have with schizophrenia and depression. We're just beginning to define aspects of the brain that are changed. That's why for the longest time, people didn't think these were really brain disorders.
Yeah.
You know, there were two kinds of illnesses, functional illnesses and organic illnesses. And psychiatric illness for the longest time, till about 30 or 40 years ago, but by many people, Tom Zatz being one of them, believed that they were extraterrestrial, they were outside the brain.
Yeah. But it's funny, though, that you're saying if the brain didn't change, we'd be in big trouble. And the primary argument from the National Institute on Drug Abuse that the fact that the brain changes is why we're in big trouble, if we're addicts.
Right, you're using big trouble in different ways. She's saying it's a brain disease because we can see changes in the brain. We have a big problem because a lot of people are becoming addicted. Let's find cures for it. She's using this as an assay for seeing whether you can see how addiction occurs in the brain, get a better insight. You know, that dopamine is important. After a while, people work even though it's no longer pleasurable for them. This has come out of imaging studies. She's a wonderful scientist.
Right.
She's made a lot of important contributions.
Right. Okay.
At this point, I'm going to throw in a question from the audience because this may help us clarify. So the questioner asked, does research show repeated addictive behaviors create the new synapses? And if so, can that be reversed? So if it can create new synapses one way towards addiction, is it possible to create new synapses out of addiction? And this is a question for you, Dr.
Absolutely.
Kandel, but
Well, first of all, there are many ways you can reverse it in principle. Okay? First of all, there's a process called habituation. Right. If I tap on this table, it irritates you. But if I keep on doing it, you say, that nut, you know, it continues to tap, and you learn to ignore it. And learning to ignore it is a process called habituation. And that is associated with a weakening of the synapse. And if you do this over a long period of time, a loss of synaptic connections. Right. So this is only a simple example of how you can oppose a process. The other thing is you can activate antagonistic processes. You can activate prefrontal executive functions that say, look, if I'm going to continue using this drug, I'm going to get myself into trouble. You know, I'm going to get this disease or that disease. It's going to shorten my life, and I'm gaining a short-term pleasure for a tremendous long-term health hazard, which is going to destroy me, going to destroy my family. So there are brain processes you can recruit that will antagonize it, not just weaken the basic drive.
Mm. Well, yeah, I'm certainly not advocating that being an addict is a good thing. And since we all agree that everything that's important about being human comes from the brain, it must be that the way we fight addiction also comes from the brain, the way we overcome it. But when you talk about the loss of synapses or weakening of synapses with habituation, that's a good example of something that, from one point of view, the NIDA point of view, the loss of synapses is very bad because, you know, we're losing gray matter volume, and that's not a good thing. But from another point of view, this is just synaptic pruning. It's a good thing. It's a good thing that we do that because it makes the brain more efficient.
The same process can be beneficial in one context and detrimental in another. That's certainly obvious, right? It depends on which synapses you lose.
Yeah, okay.
I'm going to give our other panelists the opportunity if they want to weigh in with a question or an insight or a connection.
I was thinking about, when I think about looking at people with drug problems generally having a brain disease, I guess because of my background in sociology, I also think that your social location, your social networks, all these sorts of things mitigate the problem, and so that it's very different for a very wealthy white guy who has a cocaine habit and then goes to Hawaii to get rid of his cocaine habit, and manages to change his brain, right? Because it's better to swim in Hawaii.
But his brain is involved.
Right. Oh, no, certainly his brain is involved, but I think that just focusing on that leaves us with not a very rich understanding of what's going on. The other point I want to make is that drug use isn't always habitual. Some kinds of drug use are what we would call peak experiences. When you look at people that use such drugs as ayahuasca or LSD or those sorts of drugs, in which, in some ways of thinking, you could talk about it opening up other parts of the brain. And again, I'm not a brain scientist. I mean, I just sort of kind of problematizing the most important piece, I think, when we're talking about addiction or habituation or drug use as a brain problem is that when we conceptualize it in that way, it has very different consequences for those people who get in trouble with drugs. The thought that you have changed your brain in such a way that you might not come back, and that has real consequence for whether or not people think they can change their brain. You know, whether they can have new kinds of experiences that help them to pull away from problematic drug use. And I think that their social location and position has a great deal to do with their ability, in fact, to make the sort of positive changes that you need.
Of course. No one is denying that.
Oh, no, I wasn't saying that you were.
No, let me just make it clear. The great change, for the longest time, our understanding of mind came from philosophy. Mm-hmm. With time, a branch of philosophy became empirical, and that gave rise to psychology. And then the focus was really on high-order processes, and we had cognitive psychology. The great revolution in this area occurred in the late 1960s, 1970s, when cognitive psychology merged with brain science to give rise to a new science of mind. You know, sociobiology is essentially, it's a bad term because it's sort of fell into disrepute, but you can't have a brain science without having good. Denise is a sociologist. She trained with Merton, and she trained in the Department of Sociology. That influenced her thinking, influenced my thinking about the brain. You can't have a good understanding of brain processes unless you see what it is representing. So you're absolutely right, but our function here is to bring it together.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, so this is it's actually a great opening discussion, I think, about the nature of the phenomenon that we'll be talking about, because, and I love, actually, I noticed this on the program only yesterday, that the subtitle says, Exploring the Science and Experience of an Equal Opportunity Condition. And so the members of the audience can tell that one of the word condition is unusual in my experience being part of these discussions, because usually the debate quickly goes to the question of, is the phenomena, and it's probably not even a singular phenomena of addiction. In fact, we all know, maybe this was helpful to the audience too, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, for example, no longer uses the word addiction. I see, at least with relation to substance addiction, it uses terms like substance dependence and that sort of thing. But I think it's nice to start the conference talking about the condition. And I think what people are coming to is that whatever the phenomenon that we'll be talking about for the next few days is, it's complex. It clearly, unless we're Cartesians and believe that we have non-physical souls, with those animal spirits we heard about in the introduction. Actually, those for Descartes, since I was his pupil. Those were to be distilled particles of blood. So he wasn't entirely like thinking that these were immaterial substances. But I mean, the idea is that we're embodied animals. Ever since Darwin, we have to think of ourselves as, I think, as mammals, with the fate of mammals, with the complexities of mammals. But we're also cultured creatures, and we live in social worlds. And I think what's coming out, this is not exactly a question, of course, for Professor Kandel, is that if we think of things like addiction as conditions, there are many places probably that it's a complex causal, historical, culturally defined set of problems with various leverage points. I think I'm the only, well, I'm not the only person up here on the panel who depending on how you want to put it, is an addict or was an addict. I mean, I don't use right now. This is water, not vodka. But those of us with experience there know that there are social aspects to it. Of course, it's realized in the body that we have. There are things that directly pertain to memory, for example, that Professor Kandel knows about, like they're called blackouts, which drinkers in particular know about, and something goes wrong with our memory that we don't even remember what we did the previous night or the previous day. But I think that this interesting question for this conference will be, where do we leverage the problem for people who do want out of their habits or the condition?
Right.
Do we use social mechanisms, community mechanisms? Do we use direct brain interventions? Do we use interventions at other points in the causal fray? I mean, it's just an interesting set of problems there, I think. So I wonder if you have reflections on that.
But it's clear we use what we can.
Right.
Let me make you a very simple example. What do you think of psychoanalysis?
Expensive.
Well, when I first discovered that learning leads to anatomical changes in the brain, which is a great surprise to me, I wrote a paper called Psychotherapy in the Single Synapse, because someone just had written a book called Sex in the Single Girl, so I wanted to take off on that. And it dawned on me that insofar as psychotherapy works, it's like a learning experience. It must produce anatomical. And as you probably now know, there are now several excellent studies that show if and only if you respond to cognitive behavior therapy, you undergo anatomical change in your brain. So that doesn't mean it's not a wonderful experience. It doesn't mean that the patient sees anatomical change or feels anatomical changes. They feel, their bodily response, their psychological response, their degree of comfort. But those are mediated by brain processes. Of course, we use whatever social intervention we can have, but it ultimately will become interesting to see exactly how they work and how drug therapy and social therapy might interact or might antagonize one another. Under what circumstances it might be possible by imaging, you might be able to predict that psychotherapy would work better for me and not as well for you. See, that would be very useful to know. And what kind of a therapist would be useful? Those are the kinds of things we might be able to get objective measures for.
Here's a question that comes up. What exactly, I'm a philosopher, so forgive me, what exactly is addicted? Is it the brain? Is it the person? I mean, I'm struck by Mike starting with the epigraph or having Descartes in there. Is it the brain that's addicted? The person's that addicted?
It's all of you. The person is a reflection of brain processes. One can screw up a person's brain. Phineas Gage used to be a reliable, nice guy. Damaged a certain part of her brain, became irresponsible. It's all in the brain. There's nothing else. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean love is not a wonderful experience. I don't think of my brain when, I'm in love. I think of just feeling very good. But this is coming from the brain. Being depressed comes from everything comes from the brain.
But surely, it's one thing to say that anything that happens in our world involves the brain. That's, unless we're a mind-body dualist of some sort. Usually, addiction, and I don't think this is sort of prehistoric, is often defined as a problem which produces behavioral and social consequences that are negative for the person who has the habit. Now, clearly, the negative social and personal consequences are not entirely in the brain because they're in the world. So too, the experience of love, involves not just that person and their body, but the person that they're in love with. So I think that the only concern is not that the brain isn't involved in every single aspect of our being a person, but that not every aspect of life, that the brain is not the unique and total causal contributor to everything that we experience.
Of course, my brain is not involved in Denise's brain when we're having an argument. But her brain is involved in the argument. There's nothing that happens in the world that doesn't involve the brains of the participants. And what we need to understand is how this richness of insight of sociology can be translated into what I think will be a universal language in which we will understand it, which brings together the psychological, the social, and the brain.
But I think that we still have to pay very close attention to context as well. It's a very different experience to use, for an example, marijuana in Colorado right now.
Right.
Among adults, etc., than it is to use it right here in Minnesota, where it's not legal.
Who is denying?
I'm not saying you're
social
denying.
contextual factors. I'm just
not saying that,
your brain is aware of the fact that you're in Colorado versus Minnesota,
right.
And that is what is determining how you respond to marijuana. in one
But your
context
social location frames what your brain
Sure.
can think about and believe.
Absolutely.
Okay. No,
But
what I'm saying is it's just.
But it's your brain
we
that
just can't
determines
leave
whether
that
you're
alone.
going. But the
I
brain,
can't anyway.
It's the brain that determines whether you're going to be in Minnesota or Colorado, right? You got to make a decision.
Well, I don't know if that's true. I think
No,
in a capitalist society, I think that there's a lot more forces and pressures that are going on just besides saying the fact that I'm sitting on this stage has a lot to, I mean, certainly it has to do with my brain. If I didn't have one, I wouldn't be here.
Right.
But I mean, I had to be invited. I mean, I guess the part that is understanding how the brain processes work, I think you're absolutely right, particularly when we want to get into a place where we want to intervene or change those processes. We could really, like you were saying, we could really figure out which
I'm
kind
not
of
explaining
therapy.
myself well. The brain is not just involved when you want to change something. The brain is you.
I know what you're saying.
Think of brain.
Yeah, but my brain does not exist my brain is the result of my context.
Of course.
And my experiences
Yes.
and my memory and all
Right.
those things. I guess that's just the point. And I'm not going anywhere with this. So let's move on. Move on. We're talking in a circle, and I think we agree.
I've sort of got into a full argument here.
Well, and I think this exchange shows the fact that addiction is this multi-layered, complex set of phenomena, and depending upon where we tack into it, we'll have different kinds of concerns or explanations.
Who's doing the tapping also?
There is that, for sure. I want to bring the focus back to a question from an audience member. And that has to do with the ability to alter long-term memories. So now that we've got a better sense of where memories are stored, what kind of work has been done about replacing or altering long-term memories, and what are some of the ethical considerations of that? And I think in part the question it arises because many people who work in addiction talk about triggers and associations, and the hope might be if we were able to interrupt those triggers or associations, which would involve tapping into memory, we could then perhaps stave off some craving. So I'm wondering if you'd speak to that.
Yeah, I feel very strongly that it's fine to work on processes that enhance memory, but wiping out memory, I think, is a very dangerous process.
Right.
I think that, for example, people with post-traumatic stress disorder, you can help them no longer respond with excessive fear to their experience, but you don't want to wipe out their memory. Denise and I are both emigres. We came to America during the Hitler period. She was in hiding in the south of France in a convent, and I was beaten up by my classmates when I was in Vienna. Those are horrible experiences, but they formed us.
Right.
You can tell traces of our character, my obnoxiousness and Denise's charm, date from that period. And you wouldn't want them to be different.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And that's the important connection to who we are right now is much a matter of
Yes.
what we've experienced and what we remember.
Absolutely. We should come to grips with the emotional things that are excessive and interfere with our living effectively. But the experience per se, you don't want to repress.
Mm-hmm. Another question from our audience has to do with the notion of false memory. how might memories be implanted? I mean, we know that memory can be very unreliable, but we also seem to have this category of false memory. So how does that work?
Well, if you recall a memory in a new context with, let's say, another person there that wasn't there the first time, it's possible when you recall it several years later, you will incorporate that person that was present in the first or second recall, but was not with the original experience at all. The brain is very susceptible to deception. So that you can get false memories in a variety of things. And this is one of the reasons why, number one, testimony in trials is very difficult to evaluate unless you have more than one person testifying, because testimony is flawed. And at the moment, we have no reliable brain insights that can help in a specific case. I mean, we can see how it forms in general in a control case, but there's no scan, no reliable diagnostic test we can apply to memory to see whether it's real or false. It's a major problem in legal situations. And my honest feeling is that brain science, which is an infant growing, is at the moment relatively little to contribute to things like that. I should make another point, I'm sorry, which in my enthusiasm I may not have made. This is brain science tackles the most difficult and ambitious problem we now confront. And there's been very good progress in the 50 or 60 years that Denise and I have been working in the field, but it's modest compared to where we have to go. I mean, our understanding of complex brain processes is extremely primitive. There's just the delusional optimism that scientists have when they see new methods emerging, they see progress being made, that someday we'll get there. But if I'm asked, honestly, how long is it going to be, I'd say a century. This is not around the corner. So one of the reasons we're having this discussion is because although there's very, very good reason to believe what I've been saying about the brain is responsible for all of our actions, we cannot explain many of those actions as yet, except in sort of very primitive and crude ways.
Right. I have a question, I suppose. When we all accept the role is even the wrong word, the centrality of the brain in all of our experiences and who we are and so forth. Now, when people talk about the brain and addiction, one question that comes to mind quickly is that how does this help us by talking about the brain? Now, some people say it takes us in the wrong direction because, let's face it, if you're talking about the brain and addiction, then you must be talking about addiction as a disease or a pathology, and that's not very helpful. Other people say that it's very useful because that helps us develop pharmaceutical agents that might help addicts. But in fact, pharmaceutical agents have really kind of plateaued. They're not being developed very quickly at all. And most of the ones some of the very powerful ones have been around for 50 years already, things like methadone and so forth. And I sometimes get emails from people who say a third possibility, which is they say, gee, you explained what goes on in the brain in addiction. That's very helpful for me because now I understand something when I feel these cravings or this loss of control and I feel this experience which is so challenging, hard to understand. Now I know that there's something going on inside my head, something biological, that it's not just that I'm a lazy, no good, or that I'm, a weak, morally deficient person, but there's something biological going on, and that helps me. That helps me reconceptualize my addiction. Any thoughts about?
Oh, you're absolutely right. I mean, people who are addicted are not bad. They may have become addicted because they were playing bad games, but once they're addicted, they no longer control it. They have a disease. There is a stigmata about all psychiatric disorders. There is a stigmata about schizophrenia. There's a stigmata about depression. And we all agree, you would agree that schizophrenia is a biological disease? Depression is a biological disease?
I would not agree that addiction is a disease, no. With schizophrenia, I would at least go as far as calling it a serious disorder, clearly. But anyway, that's perhaps another argument.
The genetic base of schizophrenia is not convincing to you enough that it's a disease?
There's lots of stuff that's genetic, like having an impulsive personality or a low frustration tolerance, that I would not call a disease.
No, there are lots of things that are genetic that are not diseases, but those that are genetic that are diseases are genetic diseases, they're diseases of the brain.
So the fact that it's genetic does not define it as a disease?
No, but if you can show genetically that there's a disease, there's no question.
How can you show genetically that it's a disease?
If your father has it, you get it.
Yeah.
And your child has it. Baby, that's a gene,
Hey,
okay, or family.
Sure. My father's got a big nose. I've got a big nose. That doesn't make it.
Okay, I want to try to focus it.
I think we need a course on biology before we go further, to be honest with you.
So,
Below the belt.
I think one of the questions that arises, though, about the disease language is that it seems like diseases can be very different from one another.
Sure.
If you're talking about something like, we now call it type 2 diabetes as opposed to adult onset diabetes is a disease, seems different in kind from something like cerebral palsy that, no.
Well, it depends on what you mean. Diseases means a malfunctioning of the body in some domain. And cerebral palsy is a serious disease. One would probably prefer to have type 2 diabetes, for which there are treatments, than cerebral palsy, which is more difficult to treat. I think this is a long discussion which we're not going to solve. It requires a common culture. It was as if we came into this room as a Tower of Babel. We're each speaking different languages, and we're not quite communicating with each other because we don't share a common culture. And the hope is, and this university is pioneering in this direction, that when we have a round table like this with the people, young people sitting here, they will not have the problems that we're confronting.
Right. Yeah.
That would certainly be the best case scenario. And I would say, on that note of optimism, being mindful of the clock and luncheon requirements and all that we wrap up this question and answer session. I would like for all of you to join me in thanking Dr. Eric Kandel for his talk.